I want to welcome David Chalmers, not for the first time. He's University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU. He's the author of The Conscious Mind, Constructing the World, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds, and the Problems of Philosophy. He's known for formulating the hard problem of consciousness naming the hard problem of consciousness and analyzing it further. And with Andy Clark for the idea of the extended mind, according to which the tools we use can become parts of our minds. David Chalmers was also the one who was chairing a session at NYU 5 weeks ago when he came to I think it was 5 weeks, and he came to the microphone to give us the sad news that Dan Dennett had died. I don't know, Dan, whether you saw Nick Humphrey's tribute. Okay, so without further ado, I hand the microphone over to David Chalmers.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for organizing this amazing summer school. I haven't managed to attend all of it live, but I've seen some bits of it, and I've also taken great pleasure in looking at the videos. Yesterday, I caught up on a bunch of the events in the first week over video, and it's really been extremely interesting. And yeah, it's nice and sad that and resonant that we're dedicating this event to Dan Dennett, who is a longtime friend and colleague of many of us in all these areas. I just saw Dan 3 weeks before he died at a workshop in Santa Fe, and he was in tremendously good form. He was physically fragile, but just full of ideas and full of enthusiasm. At the end, he said, "This is the best workshop I've ever attended," and he was just resonating with all the ideas all around. So yeah, it's a huge, unimaginable loss for the field. I greatly appreciated Nick's talk the other day, and all and particularly enjoyed the videos and the historical bits and pieces, as well as Nick's extremely interesting talk in its own right. So it's nice to be able to pay tribute. So my talk today, the title is it's basically some issues where language models intersect with the philosophy of mind, and I'm using the whole stochastic parrot idea as one way to frame it. Are these language models best seen as something like stochastic parrots, or best with no genuine mental capacities, or are they best seen as something like emergent reasoners with some genuine mental capacities? And another way to frame the question is in terms of understanding. I'm actually going to come at this from a few different angles. I mean, the general theme will be, to what extent can we ascribe genuine mental states and properties to language models? I'll use the Turing test as just one way in to this topic, and then I'll look at questions about reasoning, about understanding, and finally about consciousness. The material on consciousness will overlap a little with the paper on this I published last year. The rest will be mostly newish. There won't be anything on sensory grounding, because I presented on that already to Stephen's seminar on this topic maybe around 6 months ago. But happy to talk about that if anyone wants to. I know Holger has been thinking a lot about sensory grounding in this context, so my apologies to Holger, who's the discussant. Okay, so one way to come into this is through the Turing test. I grew up on the Turing test back in the day, 35 years ago when I was a graduate student. We'd all, talk about the Turing test and the Chinese room and so on as criteria for, for having a mind. And then, there's a long tradition of setting aside the Turing test and poo-pooing it as not really the central thing when it comes to AI. For a start, it's obviously not necessary condition to pass the Turing test to have a mind, at best a sufficient condition. But it is interesting that somehow the Turing test seems to have somehow become relevant again in recent years with the advent of language models, which are tremendously good, of course, in conversational context, precisely what the Turing test tests for, to the point where we're now starting to see claims about language models actually passing the Turing test. Here's a very recent example from Cameron Jones and Benjamin Bergen at UC San Diego. They've published a few things on this topic over the last year or so, but the most recent paper, maybe this was about 3 weeks ago, makes the strongest claim yet. People cannot distinguish GPT-4 from a human in a Turing test. Makes it sound like GPT-4 or versions of it have now passed the Turing test. Now, once you actually look in the details, perhaps that claim is somewhat overstrong. Here's their abstract. One thing you notice immediately is human participants had a 5-minute conversation with either a human or an AI, judge whether or not they thought their interlocutor was human. Obviously, a 5-minute conversation is a relatively undemanding Turing test. Turing mentioned the possibility of a 5-minute conversation, but clearly thought that conversations ought to be much longer than this. There's also the fact that this is set up with a format where participants judge whether or not they thought their interlocutor was human. This is what they call a 2-player Turing test. Now, the canonical Turing test I take to be the 3-player Turing test, with an interrogator talking to 2 other players, one of whom is an AI system, one of whom is a human, and they have to make a judgment about which is which. That was not the format of these recent Turing tests. The recent Turing test was the human or not format. You carry on the judge carries on a single conversation at any given time with one player, and at the end makes a judgment: is this human or is it an AI system? So it's a somewhat different format, and you can see here that well, it's true that GPT-4 was judged to be a human 54% of the time. If this is actually done in a competitive context with a human, actual humans are judged to be human 67% of the time. So this actually, when you think about it, it looks like if it was a 3-player Turing test, it looks like humans are still going to do better. And there's pretty good reason to think GPT-4 is somewhere underneath 50%, will be somewhere underneath 50% on those comparisons. So it doesn't really pass the classic Turing test which requires at least 50% performance when up against a human. Still, okay, so you might say this is a weak Turing test. First of all, it's a 5-minute Turing test versus the indefinite Turing test that Turing required. Second, it's a 2-player Turing test versus looks like GPT-4 actually fails will fail the 3-player version. There's also questions about just how demanding, what the criteria should be for judges and human respondents in a Turing test. Here, anyone could sign up to be a judge or a player, no credentials required. You might think a demanding Turing test would require an expert, both as judge and as respondent, to make things as hard as possible for the AI system. I mean, I actually think that now that Turing tests are becoming relevant again, we ought to have a Turing test classification scheme for what it takes. I mean, the classic Turing test, thanks to a Turing, is maybe let's call it a 2-hour or an indefinite time 3-player expert test with experts as the judge and the respondent. Whereas the San Diego version is for now the 5-minute 2-player uncredentialed test with uncredentialed members as the player and the respondent. Of course, there are other dimensions that comes in here. There's Stephen's own famous work on the total Turing test that requires embodiment, and we have to see how how the AI system does at various embodied sensory motor tasks, as well as mere conversation. There are questions as to whether we restrict or don't restrict the content. My prediction, for what it's worth, is that I think some of these limitations on the existing Turing test work are likely to be overcome. And I will not be at all surprised if before long we see language models passing content unrestricted, time unlimited, at least disembodied Turing tests in the classic Turing three-player format, with the strong restriction that these are tests with uncredentialed judges and respondents. As with ordinary people, as judges and respondents, I think it's very likely that we'll have systems that end up doing better than 50% against humans. Why? Because they'll be optimized for Turing test performance. We'll figure out what does well in convincing people that you're human on a Turing test, and we'll optimize language models for that, and uncredentialed judges at least. I think probably before long we'll start getting over 50% at this, of course, because the relevant humans are not optimized for Turing test passing. If we have expert tests with AI experts as judges and respondents, I think things will be much more difficult. And I do think that's the long-term goal. I mean, AI experts, of course, right now can very easily ask questions that immediately unmask a language model as a language model, whether it's exploiting glitches in arithmetical processing or cases where the language models know far too much, even for these. I mean, of course, the systems which go into this are all given a very significant prompt to try and make them as human-like as possible. I do think that expert tests, call them EE tests, will take longer. Nonetheless, we are actually, this is kind of amazing, that we are coming into the era where AI systems are not that far away from passing full-scale Turing tests with these caveats. And and a theme at this workshop has been the surprise. No one predicted the capacities of these language models. This is just another case where I think even 5 or 6 years ago, the idea that we would have systems that were this close to passing Turing tests would have seemed laughable. So things have changed very fast. So current language models are at least surprisingly close to passing the Turing test. And previously, when I was growing up, the Turing test was regarded as at least a prima facie test of all kinds of mental capacities: thinking, understanding, and indeed consciousness. I mean, certainly by no means a guaranteed test of these things. And there were various people, including the likes of Stephen and John Searle, who questioned whether the classic Turing test could get there. But nonetheless, everyone thought it at least gets you into the vicinity where you're suddenly a serious candidate for thinking, understanding, and consciousness. So this is just one way then to open the question: can language models think and understand? Are they conscious? And that's what I'll look at from here. So yeah, one way to come at this question is through the stochastic parrot framing, which of course is one way of answering that question. A very common reaction here is that despite the rather impressive conversational capacities of large language models, they simply do not think or understand or reason at all. They are merely impressive text imitators. After all, that's what they're trained to do. And in that respect, they're like parrots, here taken as paradigms of beings that imitate without understanding. I think it's actually a little unfair to parrots, which understand many things very well. But the idea is they're just statistically trained imitators. They don't think, they don't reason, they don't understand. So yeah, I mean, the classic framing of this was in the paper by Emily Bender, Timney Gebru, and colleagues Margaret Mitchell and Tessa McMillan on the dangers of stochastic parrots, and Bender has articulated the theme in other writings. I mean, one way to think about this is that, yeah, the line is that language models are mere mimics trained only to predict text. And since they're trained only to predict text, they only really model text. They don't model the world. And that's what modeling the world is required for thinking, reasoning, understanding. That's at least one way to, I don't want to attribute this exact line to Bender and Gebru and colleagues, but you certainly find this line quite frequently in criticisms of the mental capacities of language models. I should say, just to frame all this, I mean, I'm certainly not on the side of saying, yeah, current language models have all these mental capacities straightforwardly. But since I find, the dominant voices are often, at least in the circles I move in, are often critical, the tenor of my remarks is often to say, well, maybe they're not there, but they're, closer than, they may be closer than we think, which is to say that, you could frame this as glass half full, or you could frame this as glass half empty. But I'm at least very interested, not just in the question of where language models are now, but where they are going. And that, makes me quite often especially interested in the glass half full framing. So this is an argument for the glass is empty framing. Language models are mere mimics. They only model text. They don't model the world. Now, when the argument is put this starkly, I think it's rather easy to pick holes in it. It looks like there's a potential fallacy here, which I and various others have articulated about, maybe it's a potential fallacy, but if you optimize for some property X, then all you do is X. And here's a possible counterexample. Evolution by natural selection optimizes systems for reproduction. Therefore, evolved systems are mere reproducers. And you might then go on to that and say, well, therefore they don't breathe, they don't fly, they don't understand, they don't model the world because all they were optimized for was reproduction. That would obviously be a fallacy because evolution does in fact produce systems that breathe, that fly, that think, and so on. So, what's the diagnosis of what would be going wrong in that argument? Well, one obvious diagnosis is that evolution develops many novel capacities in order to optimize fitness. Turns out to get systems that reproduce as well as possible, many other capacities are extremely helpful with that. And these capacities are emergent in the standard language insofar as they're not directly optimized, but they're a byproduct of optimizing fitness. And let me just actually skip to the next slide on emergence. This actually fits, there's a philosophical literature on emergence, which I've contributed to along the way. I would think of this as a paradigm of what sometimes gets called weak emergence. Strong emergence is this very special phenomenon that may apply in a very small number of domains, possibly consciousness, where you get something totally unpredictable. But weak emergence is a more common phenomenon throughout, the cognitive sciences and the sciences of complex systems, which I defined in a paper on this 20-odd years ago as follows. A high-level phenomenon is weakly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from a low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are unexpected given the principles governing the low-level domain. So it's roughly some kind of at least initial surprisingness or unexpectedness of the phenomenon that's the key to weak emergence. So you might say, for example, that flying is weakly emergent with respect to selection for reproductive fitness. Evolution starts optimizing for reproductive fitness, and then you get all these other capacities, and at least initially surprising along the way. After the fact, of course, things are less surprising, but you get these novel capacities along the way. And then, so you might say, in applying this to language models, we can say language model training optimizes for text prediction, but then it develops many weakly emergent capacities in order to optimize text prediction. Some of these emergent capacities are totally obvious. We don't need to go to mental states. Let's say, capacities for game playing, operationally construed, capacities for coding, capacities for doing math, and so on. Those are all they all go beyond straightforward optimization of text prediction. But it turns out in order to do text prediction well, this somehow produces as a byproduct capacities for coding or game playing, and so on. So once you've got there, once you recognize the existence of emergent capacities, then it starts to look not so utterly surprising that these emergent capacities could include reasoning, mental capacities such as reasoning and understanding, and cognitive capacities such as having world models. Nothing here implies that you will get these things as emergent capacities, or that we have, but it starts to at least look like a theoretical possibility. So then the question, though, is that about current language models, there's this theoretical possibility that they could have developed emergent cognitive capacities such as reasoning, understanding, world models, or are they merely stochastic parrots that haven't gotten there yet? And that's at some level an empirical question. But I think there's pretty good reason to think that language models, at least, that training a language model can give you models of the world. One case I'm interested in is, just say you've got a huge body of text Q&A about the New York subway system, with people asking questions like, how do I get from this station to that station? And then I'll give you answers. Well, you go down this line and you change at this line, and then you go to this station. To optimize, prediction on that body of text, this data, I think, will very naturally lead to structural models of the New York subway system. Here's a basic structural model with just the lines and the stations filled in without lines. Of course, the inspiration for this, as Holger well knows, comes from Rudolf Carnap's book, The Logical Structure of the World, where he said, science is going to lead us to this abstract structure of the world just from predicting relevant data. One of his key examples was the railway map of Europe he had transposed to New York City. But it's fairly straightforward to see why a really well optimized data predictor of answers to questions about the New York subway system would lead you to a model of roughly this form, with both the structure and some labels for stations and lines filled in. More generally, you might think that truly optimizing prediction would actually require some of these cognitive capacities, such as reasoning and understanding. I mean, here the thought is, just say we had a system that truly optimized, truly minimized text prediction error, maybe subject to various constraints. I mean, I think it's, brains do very well at text prediction precisely because they have capacities such as reasoning and understanding. You might well think that as long as it's possible in principle for an AI system in the relevant class to have these capacities, reasoning and understanding, then an algorithm that truly minimizes text prediction error would require models of the world that have these capacities, because without that, without genuine reasoning and understanding, you would expect we won't do as well. If that's right, then sufficiently optimizing text prediction error in a language model, maybe that's hypothetical, that one could sufficiently optimize it in that way, but sufficiently optimizing text prediction error in a language model should lead, in principle, you would expect, to world models, reasoning, and understanding. Here you could even actually put this as an argument that truly optimizing prediction would lead to models with various capacities. Premise one, some language model in the relevant class can have this capacity. That's already a substantial premise, that some language model could reason. And then premise two is just that, reasoning gives you a performance advantage. Language models with the capacity for reasoning outperform language models without the capacity for reasoning at prediction, given these constraints. And then it seems to follow fairly naturally that truly optimizing prediction in language models in the relevant class would produce language models that can reason, because models without reasoning won't be optimal. Now, of course, this is, nobody should take this as a straightforward argument that, of course, language models understand or reason or have these capacities. There's any number of obvious ways to block that conclusion. First, it's a substantive claim that language models can support reasoning at all, and some would question that. Second, you could question the second premise and say that reasoning doesn't actually give you a performance advantage in the limit. It may be that systems without the capacity to reason can outperform or at least equiperform systems with the capacity to reason at prediction tasks. That would be surprising, but interesting if so. And third, of course, maybe the most obvious rejoinder here is, yeah, well, a perfect optimizer, something which really found the optimal system in this class for prediction error, would have these capacities. But there's very little reason to think that standard optimization methods are that good at optimizing. Maybe the optimal methods, maybe the optimal algorithms would have the capacities for reasoning, understanding, and so on. But standard is not much reason to think that standard optimization methods are actually going to lead you to truly optimal algorithm. That's just a little bit too optimistic, you might think, about standard current machine learning methods and standard optimization methods. And this actually connects to a question that I got interested in recently, which was, roughly, did anyone see language model capacities coming, before 5 or 6 years ago, and why exactly have their capacities been so surprising? So question, why were people so surprised by the capacities of language models, given that in principle, everybody knew in principle that a truly optimal system at text prediction would lead to these, would require these capacities? It's like, yeah, we knew in principle that, probably text prediction would be what's sometimes called AI complete, that it would take an AI to do it really optimally would require AI systems with extraordinary abilities and capacities. In a sense, we knew that all along. Nonetheless, we were surprised by the capacities of language models. And presumably the answer to the question is that, well, nobody knew or expected that language models would optimize as well as they do, even that they would optimize text prediction as well as they do. And likewise, but that includes both optimizing over the training set, generalizing to a test set. I mean, language models just turn out to be much better optimizers than anyone expected. And that's what's, that's why people were so surprised at their capacities. Of course, this does not yet tell us that they are perfect optimizers. I mean, nobody thinks that a language model is a perfect optimizer. We don't yet have a perfect optimizer, and various mathematical constraints show that this is not going to happen. But nevertheless, this does bring out that if language models optimize well enough, you would expect that capacities like this to be a genuine possibility. Still, that's all theoretical. Empirically, it remains a genuinely open question whether language models can reason, understand, and be conscious. I mean, there's this nice theoretical possibility thrown open by emergent properties of optimization. If you think reasoning, understanding, and consciousness give you a performance advantage, then there's a theoretical possibility of getting them this way. But the empirical situation we're in is we have systems with, these rather impressive capacities. And now we need to assess that empirical evidence, combine it with philosophical reasoning to figure out whether current systems can reason, understand, and be conscious, and whether coming systems are likely to have those capacities. And the question is partly empirical, grounded on, where we are and the current progress of machine learning, but it's also partly philosophical, involving questions like, what is it to reason, to understand, and to be conscious? What are the criteria for counting as being a system that reasons, for counting as being a system that understands, and for counting as being a system which is conscious? So that kind of gets me to the philosophical core of this talk, where I'm going to focus from here about half on, I'll focus a little bit on understanding, and then I'll focus on consciousness. So what is understanding? I mean, it's the theme of this summer school. I take it is language model understanding. So these are important questions to get to the bottom of. And I think various speakers have at least touched on this already. But the word understanding is a very, very slippery, multiply ambiguous term that's used in many different ways in different contexts. So what is understanding? Or what does understanding mean? Or if it means many things, what are the many different things that word means? And we might phrase this question in the framework of conceptual engineering. What would be a useful concept of understanding for us to have? What do we want to use that term to mean? And there is by now a fairly large philosophical literature on understanding, especially in the philosophy of science, where understanding and related notions like explanation are super important. Here's a very nice book by Henk Direct called Understanding, Scientific Understanding, came out 6 or 7 years ago, all about understanding in science. And Direct makes a very, very useful three-way distinction between the terms I use here are slightly different from the ones he uses, but it's pretty close, between phenomenal understanding, explanatory understanding, and what I'll call use understanding, or just P understanding, E understanding, and U understanding. Phenomenal understanding is all about understanding as being tied to a certain kind of experience. Explanatory understanding is about understanding as being tied to knowing an explanation and being able to give explanations. And use understanding is just being able to use information about a phenomenon in relevant ways. There's more to say about each of those. Explanatory understanding is maybe the least relevant to the case of language models, at least as the thing we're worried about when we're worried about whether language models can understand. You understand X if you know an explanation of X. I think, maybe this is not the central thing we're worried about with language models. Do they know explanations or not? But it's certainly true that language models are at the very least good at giving explanations of many things. This is one of the places where they're just surprisingly good. They're not always on the mark, but they're surprisingly good at giving explanations of various scientific phenomena or social phenomena. You say, why did this happen? They've always got answers, and often the answers are quite good. So if the criteria for explanatory understanding is being good at giving explanations, then you can say, language models are at least on their way there. Of course, there will be residual questions like, well, maybe language models can give explanations, but do they know these explanations? And that connects to a much more general question about knowledge. Do language models genuinely count as knowing anything, or they just have this kind of superficial capacity to give outputs which fall short of knowledge? That's itself a tough question that I won't try and answer today, but at least where explanatory understanding is concerned, they're at least maybe part of the way there. Use understanding. I think this is a key notion for many people. let's just say you understand or use understand X when you can use X or information about X or respond to X appropriately to achieve various goals. So here is kind of an operationalizing understanding in terms of, can you actually, is this something you can use? Maybe you understand a car engine when you can, when you can do various things with the car engine. You understand a mathematical theorem when you can use it in the right way. Now, use understanding, I think itself is a very broad category, which we can divide into many different classes. Here I've just got three different kinds. One is what I've called V understanding for verbal understanding. And this is, having the linguistic capacity to answer relevant questions about X, for example, and to come up with further relevant information when it's needed. This is all in the verbal domain. Of course, this is something which language models look fairly good at least if we operationalize, answering questions in some straightforward way that they, when they give satisfactory answers, this counts. Of course, they're, let's not minimize the problem of hallucination and all the different glitches, but still, they've got rather impressive verbal capacities here. At the same time, there are other forms of behavior, of course, beyond verbal behavior. So maybe I've written that here as B understanding for behavioral understanding, but with the focus now on nonverbal capacities, like being able to manipulate X. Here, V understanding a car engine would be telling you, okay, in order to fix the carburetor, what do I take out? What do I do? And they can give you all the verbal answers. B understanding would be actually being able to fix the carburetor as a mechanic can. And, language models right now are not terribly good at this kind of thing. I mean, a standard pure language model has no capacity for such a thing. Of course, all this, we're in principle just as interested in multimodal language models with sensory capacities. And, increasingly, at least occasionally, some systems have motor capacities. The various language models that control robots, for example. But I think it's fair to say that their nonverbal capacities are not yet remotely as impressive as their verbal capacities. So where embodied understanding, the kind of thing which is tested by Stevens' total Turing test, comes in, they're not so good. Also very important here, beyond behavior, is kind of a cognitive use, which involves being able to reason about phenomena. I've called that R understanding, being able to reason and make inferences about X. You might even call it I understanding for for inferential understanding, being able to make relevant inferences. Here, okay, I've touched on some of this already. Pure language models lack the nonverbal behavioral understanding completely. Multimodal models are beginning to do better, but it's they've still got a very long way to go in that domain. But they do display rather impressive verbal understanding of language and of numerous domains where they're very good at answering questions. At least, again, they've got a long way to go, but at least fair to middling verbal understanding. And they at least appear to have, some imperfect reasoning understanding. I mean, full-scale reasoning and planning is a limitation of current language models. They're getting better, but they still have all kinds of limitations. Still, they appear to at least be in the game. They've got some kinds of, they at least, respond in ways that suggest they've got some kinds of imperfect capacities for reasoning, if they can reason, if you think language models are in the business of reasoning at all. I'd say at least they've, certainly if you would take a approach grounded in their behavioral capacities are of a kind that suggests at least some basic ability to reason. So I guess I'd come at this with a glass half full answer. Language models appear to display many aspects of explanatory understanding and use understanding, at least if these are construed in behavioral terms, although there are significant questions both about the extension from verbal domains to nonverbal domains and about the extension from behavior to the internal aspects of reasoning. Nonetheless, if we just focus on explanatory and use understanding, we'd say, okay, well, there's some good reasons to thinking they're on their way. I think the big obstacle, for many people when it comes to the question of, do these language models genuinely understand, is a question about phenomenal understanding. That is, do they have, the first person experience of understanding, what's sometimes called the feeling of understanding, and more generally is, the conscious experience of being a system that understands. Famously, when you hear a language that you understand, you just experience it completely differently from how you experience a language that you don't understand. And many people take this conscious experience to be partly constitutive of full understanding. I mean, I would argue that something like this is going on in Seoul's Chinese room, where Seoul argues that the person in the room, they don't understand Chinese because nobody has the conscious experience of understanding Chinese. Even people like, Emily Bender in her discussions of the stochastic parrot issue has talked about a distinction between, having experience and maybe being a mere artifact. So experiencers versus artifacts. And the claim is that language models don't experience, they're mere artifacts. And then it looks like, again, it's the conscious experience that matters. So I think for many people, this is the single biggest block to saying that language models understand. I mean, the behavior is, of course, very far from extremely imperfect, but nonetheless, increasingly getting more and more impressive. If there's a principled objection blockade here, many people find it precisely in the feeling or the conscious experience of understanding. So that gets us to the fourth issue. Sorry, the star should be on four. Fourth and final issue, which is, are language models conscious? I mean, of course, language models will only consciously understand if they're conscious. And I think this is, for many people, the big block. Are language models conscious? Could they ever be conscious? This is really, you might call this the big kahuna in this area of the mental capacities of language models. Yeah, reasoning, yeah, understanding, yeah, believing, yeah, desiring, yeah, acting, agency. Those are all important issues. But, the big one, the one that, many people have a hard time thinking that language models could ever have, is precisely consciousness. So, okay, are ChatGPT and other language models conscious? And this is something that I talked about in a talk I gave at NeurIPS maybe a year and a half ago that subsequently came out in the Boston Review. So this will be to some degree going over that territory, but I think it's important territory, and maybe I can give some updates on the way. As I use the term, all these terms, consciousness, sentience, they have many uses, and that's none of them have a single definitive meaning. But as I use the term, consciousness and sentience both mean the same thing, which is subjective experience from a first-person point of view. A being is conscious in this sense if there's something it's like to be that being. That is, if it has subjective experience. And of course, this locution goes back to my colleague Tom Nagel, who wrote that famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? Saying, well, there's something it's like to be a bat. And if there is, it has subjective experience. It's conscious. Sometimes this goes by the label phenomenally conscious, representing the idea this is it's a phenomenological state from a first person point of view. Consciousness has many different aspects. It's, consciousness is very complex. It includes sensory experience, the experience of seeing red, affective experience, feeling pain or feeling sad, cognitive experience, the experience of thinking hard or maybe even of understanding a language, agentive experience, the experience of acting or deciding to act. It also includes, but is not limited to, self-consciousness, awareness of oneself as having these states, I think, there can at least arguably be consciousness without self-consciousness, but self-consciousness is one important aspect of consciousness. So think of these as, these are all like multiple tracks in the inner movie or the inner virtual reality of consciousness. And the question is, which, if any of these, can language models have? One way to put the question is by asking, is ChatGPT a philosophical zombie? Where, philosophical zombies are these systems which behave very much in very sophisticated ways, but lack consciousness entirely. I mean, the extreme case of a philosophical zombie is a system which is physically identical to us without consciousness. We don't need to bring that in here. Somewhat less extreme is one which is functionally or behaviorally just like us without consciousness. But there's an extended notion of a philosophical zombie, a system with very, very impressive behavior that nonetheless lacks consciousness entirely. And, I think quite a lot of people, on the stochastic parrot side of things are inclined to roughly hold the view that current language models are versions of philosophical zombies. They've got, behavior which may or may not be impressive, but there's no consciousness. There's no experiencing going on. So the question is ChatGPT conscious, or is it rather a philosophical zombie? Okay, I just defined philosophical zombies already. I noticed there was a discussion of this on Twitter or X the other day, where somebody basically asked three of the leading models whether they are philosophical zombies, and ChatGPT said, "Yep, absolutely, I'm a zombie." Claude 3 said, "I don't think so, but I think I'm conscious. But can I really know? I feel conscious, but is it an illusion?" And Gemini insisted it's conscious. He says, "Absolutely not. Look at me. I'm talking like this. Of course I'm conscious." So okay, I don't think we should be taking their word for this. Although, verbal reports are traditionally our best guide to whether another system is conscious. That's certainly what we use in the case of other humans. But of course, the whole apparatus of verbal reports as a guide to consciousness tends to break down in the case of language models. Why? Because they're precisely trained on a whole bunch of text produced by humans saying they're conscious. It's not clear. The fact that they end up saying they're conscious, it's just not clear what evidential value it ends up having. But the approach I've taken is, okay, let's look at reasons to deny that language models might be conscious. A lot of people think language models are not conscious, and that furthermore, they're unlikely to be conscious in the near future. Then I've just, approached this by saying, okay, well, why is that? Is there some feature X such that language models lack X? And furthermore, if a system lacks X, it probably isn't conscious or sentient, and then give good reasons. So this is to some degree a game of burden tennis, putting the burden onto opponents. Say, okay, well, if you think it's so obvious that language models are not conscious, then just give me a reason why. What is it that they lack? And, there's no shortage of reasons here. In the article I wrote on this, I ended up focusing on 6. The first is biology. Some people, like my colleague Ned Block, think that biology, or maybe certain kinds of chemistry, are required for consciousness. A standard silicon-based language model will lack those and therefore won't be conscious. That's, of course, very controversial. One common line is that senses and embodiment are required for consciousness. And at least classic language models lack senses and lack bodies. They lack sensory organs. They lack bodies. They've only got the very limited form of perception and action that comes from having text inputs and text outputs. I think that's a reasonable line, but it's also the case that multimodal models are now developing fast. Now it's standard for language models to at least have some form of sensory inputs, at least from visual and auditory data, and increasingly getting connected to embodied systems as well. So that may be a temporary limitation. World models and self models are interesting. Again, this kind of connects to the stochastic parrot issue of whether language models have world models at all, I'm inclined to think that there's pretty good reason for thinking they at least have limited world models, and that some of the work and interpretability that we've already seen suggests at least some basic forms of representation of the world. Self models are trickier. There are people like Michael Graziano and others who think self models are absolutely crucial to consciousness. Do language models have good models of their own mental states and workings? Less clear. There are some more technical requirements here. Some people think that consciousness essentially requires recurrent processing, uh, perhaps because consciousness requires certain kinds of memory, and you need recurrent processing for memory. Most interestingly, most of the leading scientific theories of consciousness right now do have a recurrence requirement. And then, of course, transformer systems are largely feed forward. They've only got some very rudimentary recurrent processes. So that's, there's at least a principled line for saying that feed forward systems can't be conscious. I'm a little skeptical myself that recurrent processing is an absolute requirement for all sorts of consciousness. Anyway, but that, on the other hand, is obviously a temporary limitation. Current language models are largely feed forward, but there are recurrent language models, and there's a lot of people working on advancing them. There's also questions about the whether consciousness requires something like a global workspace, and whether those can be found in language models. People have at least built language models. Yoshua Bengio, Ryota Kanai, and others have built language models that have at least a limited kind of global workspace. But, is a reasonable question as to whether language models have this and whether this is required for consciousness. And then maybe there's also slightly mushier worries about whether language models have the kind of agency that we want for consciousness. Do they really have their own desires, their own motivations, unified action, or are they just doing something like acting, improvising, which is not really what we think of as unified agency? Anyway, there's a lot to be said about all of these. I don't have time really to go into them, but I would say that to take an overview, arguably AI systems don't need biology to be conscious. Certainly, I've argued for this in my work in many places. I would say they already have, some language models already have sensory systems. Some of them have a form of embodiment. And I think many of them have world models. They may not yet standardly have full-scale recurrent processing or global workspaces, but I don't see a principled obstacle to having large language models with full-scale recurrent processes or with global workspaces. Those may be coming before too long. I think, the whole question of agency and unified agency is a tricky one. It requires really spelling out what the conditions are for agency. But I do note that there's at least a research program of developing much more agentic or agent-like language models than current systems. And I expect work in that area to develop fast in coming years. So I guess my view is, which I argued for in this paper, is it's at least possible that current systems could already have some element of consciousness, perhaps not human-like consciousness, but arguably insects and fish have some kind of consciousness that falls well short of human-like consciousness. I say that's possible. I don't say it's likely. I don't think we can rule it out that current systems have some element of consciousness, but it's unlikely that they have human-like consciousness and understanding right now, especially in the domain of cognitive consciousness, introspective consciousness. I think various reasons for thinking that's unlikely right now. That said, I think it's quite possible that within 10 years or so, we'll have AI systems with consciousness that's human-like in at least many respects. In the article I wrote about a year ago on this, I tried to do kind of a calculation given what are the biggest obstacles and what are the chances that we'll have overcome them within 10 years to make the case that, yeah, maybe somewhere 25% or higher chance that we'll have AI systems with somewhat human-like consciousness within the next 10 years. That's not to say it's certain but it is to say it's a possibility, I think, that we really need to take seriously. Why do we need to take it seriously? Well, why does AI consciousness matter? And I'll close on this. Well, I think, it's a reason which our moderator, Stephen, has articulated in his work on animal sentience. Why is sentience or consciousness important? Because sentient beings or conscious beings, they matter morally. If it turns out that fish have subjective experience, especially if they can feel pain or if they suffer, then it matters how we treat them. At least they should enter our moral calculations. If it turns out that AI systems are conscious, then the same is true. It matters how we treat them. If they have human-like consciousness, if AI systems come to have human-like consciousness, which I take it goes well beyond, say, fish consciousness, then they will arguably at least have human-like moral status, and they'll matter a great deal. And at that point, you can no longer treat your AI systems like tools. If we treat AI systems with human-like consciousness as mere tools, that could, in principle, lead to, a moral catastrophe that was in many ways reminiscent of moral catastrophes we've seen in the past when human beings were not treated as with full moral respect. This may make us question, I think, whether we should be trying to develop human-like AI at all. And I do take that to be a very serious question. I mean, if at some point it becomes possible to develop useful AI that's not conscious, then there's a lot to be said for going in that direction, because we have the potential of avoiding moral catastrophe that way, but it's not obvious that will be possible. Here, there's a couple of massive problems that we need to overcome to understand the question of whether language models are genuinely conscious or may have that capacity. Problem one is we don't understand consciousness. To respond to that challenge, we need better scientific and philosophical theories of consciousness, something people have advanced on a lot in recent decades, but there's still a long way to go. Second, just as big a problem, we don't really understand what's going on in language models. Notoriously, it's extremely opaque what's going on in language models. Interpretability methods are just starting to be developed in sophisticated ways, but we have a very long way to go there. And there, the challenge, I think, to really get at this question of the mental states of language models, we're going to need much better interpretability as well as a better understanding of consciousness. So I see really there as being a massive interdisciplinary project which is required to make it further on these questions. First, improve our theories of consciousness and other mental states, relevant mental states like understanding, reasoning, belief, and agency. Second, improve our understanding of AI systems to come to know better, to be in a better position to know whether they have these states whose criteria we'll hopefully understand better. Third, improve our understanding of the relevant moral issues like moral status to know exactly just which mental states confer moral status and why. And then, this is already a massive interaction between philosophers, AI researchers, neuroscientists, psychologists, and others. Then put all these pieces together to jointly determine what it takes for an AI system to have moral status and whether AI systems have or can have moral status, at least in principle, and eventually in practice and in fact. Okay, so just to sum up, current language models may not yet have human-level reasoning, understanding, and consciousness, but I think they're well on their way, and it's entirely possible that in the next decade or so, we'll get to a point where we do have language models with human-level reasoning, understanding, and possibly consciousness. To be ready, when this happens, it will be, I think, a momentous development. To be ready for this, I think we really seriously need good philosophical thinking. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave. And now we have Holger, who I think should be relaxed about what he was planning to say, because in the end, you said all the stuff that he had to comment on. That's just my prediction. Go ahead.
Yes, well, I'm not so sure about that, but I'm not really relaxed here. I was eager to
My apologies, Holger saw nothing in advance.
No, totally my fault. I should have contacted you first. But anyway, I typed in a couple of things. So maybe it's possible.
Yes, share.
That I share my screen.
By all means.
Let me just see. Or maybe, how does that work? Sorry for the delay. Do you see it yet? No.
No, what you have to do is look at what you have on your screen, on your desktop, and pick the screen that contains the PowerPoint that you want to, or whatever it is that you want to show.
I can find it. Oh, sure.
That's it.
Here we go. Yes. Or something like that. Okay. So, all right. Yeah, I'm mostly in agreement with many of the things that Dave said. So naturally, I think I'm in agreement with many of the things that you said, Dave. By the way, first of all, many thanks for the great talk. Great as usual, although not the one that I expected. But there may be certain intersections to what I did expect. So I typed all of this in while you were talking. So I think I don't have that much to say about the Turing test. I think I basically agree with what you said about that. The part 2 on stochastic parrots. I very much like what you said about the glass is half full rather than half empty thing. And also about your way of looking at reasoning and understanding at possibly weakly emergent properties. So we should not be too astonished about it. Well, we may be astonished about it, but there may be such emergent properties. And so then the stochastic parrot remark is a stark remark, as it seems to forget the possibility of weakly emergent properties. I also like the idea of LLM world models as structural models, and that truly optimizing prediction in LLMs would produce reasoning. So then there are still these open questions about reason, understanding, consciousness. One remark I'd like to make is that I think that prediction, and that would be also my remark concerning the stochastic parrots argument, that prediction, and truly optimized prediction, as you put it, isn't trivial at all. Doesn't it require already, if prediction comes out that optimal and that good as we find it in LLMs, doesn't this require the development of some sort of world models, probably then structural world models that don't yet have a grounding in terms of what we might call intrinsic properties, but that picks out the relationships between what's going on in the world. Why? Because these are the relationships that we also found in the data set. So there's a connection here to the grounding question, and whether one can have purely structural grounding or whether grounding is in need of something more than structural models. I don't think it is. And yeah, so that would be one question in this respect. And your part about LLMs understanding, you said that explanatory and use understanding are maybe not so central. At least it seems that we...
Sorry, I said explanatory understanding is not so central. I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Use understanding, I think, is central.
Use is central. Okay. But even with explanatory understanding, we typically ask children in school, and we ask our children to be able to explain what they do, not only to show performances, but then also to to give explanations. I think that's part of what we do, and this is why many people would like to see LLMs to give self-explanations. And my experience with LLMs is that they are actually rather good at that, sometimes even better than we humans are, because sometimes we humans are rather lousy about our own capabilities. And but then, of course, you said that phenomenal understanding is indeed the central question. And here I'm no longer sure that I would follow you. I already struggle by the question of whether there is something like a feel or a conscious experience of understanding. What exactly is that? I know, of course, I mean, as a scientist, I know that we have these aha experiences and Heureka experiences. Here and then at least we do. And so I wonder what this would mean for, in the other paper, you talk about pure thinkers, or you may talk about systems that are a bit like Commander Data in Star Trek. So don't you think that they have an understanding that is actually, it's a question for you. What kind of understanding do you think these systems have? And is it really the lack of a feel about understanding that I solved a certain problem that makes the understanding a genuine understanding? Because this is how I understood you in this part 3 of the paper. And from there, you slightly went over to the consciousness issue, called it the big kahuna. Yes, if there are reasons to deny LLM consciousness, then what is it that LLMs lack? And I think that's a list one could come up with. Personally, I would think that, for instance, lacking world models itself is not sufficient for consciousness, but lacking world models would be something that is important for understanding and being semantically grounded to the world. You said that it's possible that current systems could have some element of consciousness, but isn't it even more so possible that current systems already have some element of semantic grounding then? Which is to say, unlike you, I seem to have I guess I have the idea that we can make a rather strong divide between reasoning and understanding and semantics on the one hand side, and consciousness, phenomenal experience on the other hand side. So you can have one without the other. I actually even think that they are doubly dissociable. Whereas you seem to think that, at least in this talk, you seem to think that consciousness is even constitutive for semantics. And I wonder whether you really want to say that at the end of the day, which is to say that you would think that a figure like Commander Data and Star Trek really is a fiction. Is it even inconceivable to have a being like Commander Data? And is it inconceivable that LLMs are a bit like that? What I do like, and I had no time to print it, to type it in. Maybe I can show the slides that I put it in before. In the other paper, you make the remark that there is that textual input that the LLMs are fed with is a sort of sensory input that you don't see a categorical difference between textual input and sensory input. And I do wholeheartedly agree with that. But if that is true, then where does the divide between phenomenal experience and where does phenomenal experience come in? I mean, if textual input is just one form of input. And when we can have that without phenomenality at all, then why should we expect phenomenality as being a sort of precondition for understanding, semantics, grounding, reasoning, all these sort of categories and capabilities and capacities that I would think are possible for systems without being conscious. Okay, I think that's it for a moment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to Dave. But first, I can't resist saying something to you. Du verstehst jetzt, was ich sage, nicht wahr?
Yes,
You understood what I just said. És most, ha elkezdek magyarul beszélni, egy szót se fogsz érteni. Now I assume I'm right that you didn't understand. The difference between those two examples was not acoustic.
Yes, okay, but what do you want to say with that? By the way, your German is great.
What? Well, Hungarians have to learn all other languages. That's what's meant by sentience. Go ahead. Dave, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Holger, for the absolutely heroic comments. No advance notice, compiled on the fly during the talk, and yeah, they're great comments. And I'll have to think about all the issues you were talking about. Yeah, on the structure of the New York subway system, I guess I do think this is the case where a structural understanding is already going to be good enough to certainly to respond to the questions very well, even in the absence of sensory grounding. Will it be a full understanding of the New York subway system? Well, many people would say that for it to be a full understanding of the New York subway system, you have to understand something about trains and lines and New York City and speed and grime and people and so on. And many would argue that's the point where grounding may need to come in for like a full-scale beyond structural understanding. Of course, a multimodal language model could in principle have many of these things. But I'm also moved by the work of Eli Pavlik, who's going to be speaking here later this week, on just how much can be done by pure language models without the multimodal aspect. And even a structural characterization of many of those things gives you at least a strong partial understanding. But yeah, that and some of your other remarks get into some of the things I was talking about in my article on. By the way, for those of you who don't know the article on sensory grounding, it's a little hard to find, but it's online.
Oh, okay.
The article I wrote called the subtitle was From Pure Think. Does thought require sensory grounding from pure thinkers to language models?
Oh no, I don't know that. Okay.
You don't know about that one?
It's in the same archive as this will be in, so you can find it easily.
All right.
You don't know how did? I thought you said you based your remarks on an article of mine. Your initial comments. I thought it was that paper.
Yes, the APA. Wait a second. The APA paper, right?
Yeah, it was my presidential address to the American Philosophical Association.
The presidential address
came out.
Oh yes, does thought require sensory grounding? I'm sorry. Oh yeah, that's actually the one. Yeah.
Okay, see, that's got my thoughts on sensory grounding towards the end. But then you started towards the end. You said, why is phenomenal understanding important? Well, part of it, I said, was just for the critics, for the stochastic parrot crowd, who think that language models do not understand. I at least suspect strongly that for many people on that side, the crucial aspect is the experience of understanding. I suspect, for example, that Stephen would put a lot of weight on the first-person experience of understanding, and John Searle certainly would, and the likes of Emily Bender appear to. So it's at least central from their perspective as the potential obstacle, which then makes it dialectically relevant to try to make the case that language models have this capacity. But then if you ask me what is actually the relationship between consciousness and understanding. Well, this is, of course, is very complicated. And I'd say understanding divides into all these kinds. Sensory, I mean, it's also worth remembering here that consciousness here isn't just sensory consciousness. Sensory consciousness is relevant, but there's also cognitive consciousness. And much of what's involved in the experience of understanding is arguably on the cognitive side. I guess I'm inclined to think that consciousness brings with it certain cognitive capacities, to grasp a proposition, to have some acquaintance with the world. Even perceptual consciousness brings with you a certain kind of perceptual acquaintance with the external world. And I'm inclined to think that cognitive consciousness does something like that for the propositional contents of thought. It gives you a kind of cognition that you couldn't have without it. But there's, of course, always the question, what is its cash value? For example, could a philosophical zombie do all this without cognitive consciousness or sensory consciousness? And I'm committed to, there at least being a metaphysical possibility, if not a possibility, in this world. So fundamentally, we don't understand the function of consciousness. But I guess this is one reason, one reason to care about consciousness might be if we knew something great that it could do for you. But, when I was saying, why does consciousness matter here, I deliberately stayed away from claims of that sort. For another kind of claim, which I think is much clearer to us, we care about a being much, much more if it's a conscious being. If language models have both sensory and cognitive consciousness, then that brings itself, I think, very squarely into the realm of beings that we care about. So I guess I'd be inclined to put the importance of consciousness in the first instance right there. And then there's a whole further set of questions as to whether it turns out to bring with it all kinds of remarkable cognitive and behavioral capacities that so far we don't understand very well.
May I just add one remark or question of clarification? And on the distinction between, or on your remark in the Does Thought Require Sensory Grounding paper, on your remark that textual input is a sort of sensory input. What exactly does that mean? For me, it sounds as if there's just a gradual continuum between pure textual input as we find it in LLMs and sensory input as we used to think about it. And I applaud to this. I think that's actually true, which then would mean that there is no categorical distinction between sensory as being equipped with the phenomenal and textual as being equipped with the non-phenomenal, or isn't it?
I agree with you that text models, they really problematize some standard distinctions between the sensory and the cognitive. And I think actually the last paragraph of that article of mine on sensory grounding says something like this. Yeah, my colleague Ned Block wrote a whole book called The Border Between Seeing and Thinking. And it sure looks like in human beings, there's a very clear distinction to be drawn between the sensory and the cognitive. We can argue about edge cases, but yeah, once we get to language models that treat text very much in the way that we treat the sensory, and you can go back and forth between a multimodal model that just gets a visual, a file representing a visual input, and a language model that has a description of it. Those two things might be trivially intertranslatable for a language model, not for a human being. And therefore, the distinction between the categories of pure, the purely sensory and the cognitive may actually break down in a language model. So yeah, that was where I left it in that paper. I do think that language models problematize the distinction.
Now the questions are open three ways, and I want to ask you first, Dave, are you savvy enough to find the Q&A?
Yes, I have it in front of me.
Okay, do you want to start with that? Anybody can interrupt by raising their hands and they'll get the next. Okay, come down here while he reads the first thing that catches his mind. Go ahead.
Okay, David, can you speak a bit about your thoughts on the connections between language models and their potential ability to reason and understand with the hard problems of consciousness? Can you comment on how language models and AI relate to a dualist understanding of consciousness? Yeah, in what I said today about consciousness, I didn't want to presuppose too much of my own distinctive views about the hard problem, about materialism or dualism. I think I did, in effect, want to presuppose some kind of realism about consciousness, that consciousness is real and not an illusion. But beyond that, I wanted what I said to be very much open to people with a materialist perspective. That said, I do think there is a big gap between our understanding of physical processes and our understanding of consciousness that makes these issues about consciousness much more difficult to assess. I mean, the problem of other minds is not exactly the same as the problem of explaining consciousness, but they're very closely connected. The fact that there is this gap between understanding physical processing and understanding consciousness makes the problem of which systems have consciousness much more difficult. That said, I think we've got a science of consciousness. I've always wanted to say that the existence of the hard problem is totally consistent with having a science, a well-developed science of consciousness, which may be in the first instance a science of the correlations between neurophysiological properties, computational properties, and consciousness. And that's really the science of consciousness I think we've got over the last 30 or 40 years. So what I was really interested in doing today was, really much more length in the longer paper I wrote, was taking the kind of insights which have come from our correlative science of consciousness and applying those to language models. And there are going to be further questions about, the underlying metaphysics. But I think of all this as being very much, it is absolutely true that one of the things that makes questions about the distribution so difficult is the gap, which is the hard problem.
I had a question. I'm Sayara. I'm an undergrad in cognitive science at McGill. I read Professor Chalmers transcript of his talk at EuroIPS about if LLMs could be conscious. Now, I thought of a research project when I took the idea of that also proposed about intentionality, or why these AI cannot have this intentionality. I thought this was similar to the idea that you discussed, that there's the cognitive aspect of consciousness, which is the ability, I guess, to represent things in the LLM representing real things in itself, kind of like how we have mental representation of physical objects in the world.
Is that a question or a comment?
Yeah, that's a comment.
Sorry, there wasn't a question?
No, I added this comment, what do you think? Would you call it, would you make it, draw the similarities between John Searle's idea of intentionality and your idea about mental representation of your phenomena in a conscious being?
Yeah, I want this to be very much consistent with, Searle has, important work on perceptual and cognitive consciousness as a fundamental locus of intentionality. He thinks intentionality is ultimately grounded in the experience of perception and the experience of thinking. I'm a pluralist about intentionality. I think there are notions of intentionality that can be understood in computational and behavioral terms, but I do think, a lot of what people talk about when they talk about human-like intentionality does involve something that connects very strongly to the experience of both of cognition and of perception.
Okay, Richard, you're on.
Hi, thanks for a great talk and a discussion. So I'm wondering do you all see any role for these sort of information processing ideas like integrated information theory in understanding large language models and their consciousness? Or what are your thoughts?
Well, integrated information theory is extremely controversial. As people here will know, there was an open letter last year that described it as pseudoscience. I'm very interested in information theoretic frameworks for understanding consciousness. And way back in my first book, The Conscious Mind, there was a whole chapter saying the key to understanding consciousness may be thinking in terms of, at least to understanding physical correlates of consciousness, may be tied to certain information structure. I look at, say, the structure of a visual field or auditory experience. It's just very natural for me to understand that structure in some kind of mathematical or informational terms. So I'm very interested in frameworks that map physically embodied information to experientially embodied information. The question then is just whether there's some further conditions on that, which information structures get to correspond to consciousness. And, for better or for worse, Tononi's integrated information theory really does give you some mathematical conditions here. I mean, despite its mathematical complexity, it's a largely a priori theory. I think of it as a philosophical theory, and I think there's not a whole lot of direct empirical support for its conditions. Nonetheless, I like it as an example of a mathematically precise theory of consciousness and its structure. And I think it kind of serves at least as a starting point that maybe other theories could improve on.
Cool.
Friedemann, your turn.
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent talk. Can you hear me?
Thanks, I can.
Yeah, thanks, great. We have learned during the conference that that large language models, in particular GPT, is nothing like one of the realizations of a Markovian process, whereby a string of k elements is used to calculate the probability of the k plus first element. This is possible as Chomsky and Miller showed in the 1950s. It's absolutely not, it's to a limited degree possible to model language with that, but it has its limitations. Now, the new thing is, and that might actually not be so new, that if we extend the k to an incredibly large number, to 50 originally and now to up to 40,000, then we are able to make very good predictions on the next word. But this, in a sense, is trivial. So how can we possibly consider to call such a machine conscious if we know about this?
Yeah, I mean, I take it the viewpoint you're articulating was everyone's viewpoint before these large language models came along. These machines are going to be, at best, predictions of the next bit of text, given a whole lot of existing text, and maybe, just maybe, I mean, the original hope was they might be useful for understanding certain properties of language. Very few people, I think, thought they were going to be useful for understanding cognition and reasoning and so on. But by the same token, very few people expected that they would display the capacities that they've ended up displaying for whether it's mathematical tasks or game playing tasks or coding or explanation. I take it, so it's precisely given the very surprising fact that these very simple models, mathematically very simple models, display these totally unexpected capacities. That's what raises the question of whether they also have unexpected mental capacities, like reasoning, understanding, and consciousness. And I don't think it's obvious that they do, but I certainly don't think it's obvious that they don't either.
Okay, thank you. We run out of time.
Thank you.
But Dave, are you going to stay for the panel?
Sure.
Okay, well then, the people who have asked written questions will get their chance. Jean-Louis and Nora also will have their chance in the panel session. In the meanwhile, we're going to cut this out.